Last one, I think. I like this one too, from T.M. Smith, and it's Bernoulli. Bernoulli is an Italian scientist. He's kind of the unsung hero of the modern world in a lot of ways. Every time you get in an airplane, you are being magically lofted. I think I understand more about flying certainly than any 100,000 other passengers, and maybe more about flying than, I don't know more than 1 million passengers, because there's a lot of pilots out there. But I know more about the dynamics of what happens in an airplane than just about anybody. And I think I'm the most amazed of all. Every single time I fly, I get a window seat. Every single time I get a window seat. And every single time I look out the window. And more often than not, I'm getting a good look at the wing. And every time that airplane rotates at 160, 180 knots or whatever, I am just amazed and delighted. I'm just smiling. And I fly a lot. I mean, it's not like, I fly a lot. I've taken hundreds and hundreds of commercial flights. And every single time they taxi onto the runway and they just hold there for a second, every time you feel the power coming up, every time those throttles start to run, every time those engines come to full power and you start to accelerate, I just start grinning like an idiot, like a fool. Start grinning like an idiot. And down we go, down the runway, boom, boom, faster, 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 boom, 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 160, 180 knots, whatever the number is, the nose comes up and then it sits on the mains for a while, the angle of attack increases, and then it just elevates, it just rises. And nobody thinks about why. But one of the things I wanted to take Bernoulli for is that people do not understand this medium that we live in. I keep talking, I guess this is my bitch and moan session for the bitching moaning episode. But, and you're welcome, Marianne. But people need to understand these things. And one of the things, not just Bernoulli's principle, which provides the lift on the airplane that makes you be able to go visit Grandma during Thanksgiving. People don't understand the power of the atmosphere. They don't understand how dense this atmosphere, this medium that we move through really is. We assume the air is completely intangible. We assume the air is we act as if we live in a vacuum, and essentially we do. For all intents and purposes, moving at the speeds of animals. Some animals have to deal with aerodynamic drag, but we're not one of them. Maybe the fastest runners in the world do, but by and large, you walk down the street, you're moving so slowly relative to the air molecules that drag is essentially non-existent. You might as well be walking through a vacuum. If you had a backpack on and you were walking through a vacuum, you wouldn't notice any difference, really, no noticeable difference. So we think of the air as being very, very, very ethereal, and ethereal means ether, but very thin and not of any consequence. And the idea that the air, that the atmosphere could be as dense as concrete is utterly, utterly, utterly impossible for us to visualize unless you really think about it. But when you look at explosions, especially conventional explosions, in a humid atmosphere, you can see it when you look down on some of those footage from the Vietnam War, these expanding rings, and you can see it also in some bomb videos. You can actually see this bubble of expanding air that's coming outside of an explosion. And people think, well, the building got knocked down. What knocked down the building? People think that when a bomb goes off, it's the fire that knocks down the building, but it's not the fire. The fire's got nothing to do with it. The fire of the explosion is essentially, it's not in the picture for virtually all of the damage that gets done. What knocks down buildings and kills people is this blast wave of compressed air. The air gets compressed so much that the air gets pushed, and the air molecules get pushed so tightly together, and the resistance on the other side of the explosion is so great that the air assumes the density of solid matter for a few seconds or milliseconds or whatever the case may be. It is like an expanding bubble of concrete is coming out of that explosion, and that force hits a building and knocks in all the windows and knocks the building down if the overpressure is enough. So you measure the pressure on a building in pounds per square inch. How many extra pounds per square inch is it pushing against that building? And it's the air. It's the air that knocks it down. So we move so slowly through the air that we assume that the air is just simply not there. But there's not a kid that I ever knew that didn't, at some point in his life, driving in a station wagon or in a car, roll down the windows, put his hand outside the window, and then start increasing the angle of attack on your hand so that you start doing this. And if you start increasing the angle of attack on your hand goes up. It doesn't go back. It wants to go back anyway. That's just parasite drag. But if you start to increase the angle of attack, just at 60, 70 miles an hour, you can feel your arm getting pushed back by the drag and also going up because the air is flowing over the top of your hand, which is functioning as a wing, and there's a low pressure area on the top of your hand, and it's pulling you up. So the way to think about flying, when I try to tell people about flying, and I teach a lot of people flying, is that if you think about the strongest car vacuum you've ever experienced at a car wash, the best one you ever had, and some of these things have pulled the blood right out of your hand, right? And just lurches onto your hand, and you try to pull this off the wall or something. If you imagine, and the thing's got an aperture this big, right? If you imagine that you've got 60,000 of these things on every surface of the vertical surface of the wing, you've got just car vacuum, pushed together against each other so that the entire surface of the wing is nothing but thousands and thousands of hoses with this gigantic vacuum above them, then all of a sudden it's not so hard to imagine lifting the airplane off of the ground using thousands and thousands and thousands of car vacuums that are sucking onto the top of the wing. And that's exactly precisely what happens. It's just that you don't have the tube. That's exactly precisely what happens. It's that pressure. So the pressure on the top of the wing is very low. The pressure on the bottom of the wing is at least atmospheric pressure, usually a little bit higher. And it pulls the wing up like the same way that the vacuum pulls it. And we don't realize any of this stuff. A drinking straw. Do I have one here? I got the water. I don't think I have a straw here. Use a drinking straw, right? And you take a drink. You don't think twice about it, but you think that somehow you suck the water up into your mouth or the Coke. But it's not really what's happening. What's happening is when you suck on a drinking straw, you're reducing the air pressure inside the straw, but the air pressure on the top of the drink is still the same. So the air pressure on the top of the drink is pushing the drink down. And if you're not sucking on the straw, if the straw is just sitting in the cup, you got the air pressure, ambient air pressure over the liquid pushing the drink down, and you got the ambient air pressure in the straw pushing back, and so it's steady state. You suck on a straw, you're really just reducing the air pressure in that straw by just a tiny little bit. And the air pressure on the drink pushes the liquid up through the straw. And it's a miracle. It's a miracle. And the great thing about this procedure, which was determined, it wasn't discovered by Bernoulli, but he did. I don't think it was discovered by Bernoulli. I think Bernoulli did the math on it. That the air will flow around a curved surface, and as it does, the air molecules begin to gap. They start to separate, and as they separate, that is the definition of lower air pressure, and the pressure difference between the bottom of the wing and the top of the wing will lift a 747 with 1,000,000 pounds. 1,000,000 pounds. Up it goes. Absolutely amazing. It's absolutely amazing. And all the control surfaces work the same way too. Even the rudder, which is basically just a wing at a right angle, the rudder is neutral to aerodynamic drag, but when you put the rudder out there, part of the rudder sticks into the airflow and wants to be pushed back and pushes the tail back, but most of the work of the rudder is on the part of the side that the air doesn't see, because now the rudder's curving away from the vertical stabilizer, and that's creating curve, which means vacuum, and that vacuum pulls the tail rather than pushes the tail. That's where most of it comes from. Bernoulli sucks. That's how it works. Planes fly because the air sucks. It's a pressure differential. But the power of the air is unbelievable. And you just look at an explosion, what an explosion does. It's not metal coming at you, and it's not wood. It's air that's so compressed that it feels like air, like metal or wood. So I just love these kind of things. I do this kind of science stuff all day. It's really, really fun to talk about these kind of things. Bernoulli really developed them. And I should know this, and I don't. One thing I do know for an absolute certain fact was that the reason the Wright brothers were the first to fly is because the Wright brothers were the first ones to look at flying as a scientific problem to be solved practically, not an engineering problem or even a design problem. A bunch of people, Otto Lilienthal prominent among them, preceded the Wright brothers, and Otto Lilienthal had built gliders, hang gliders basically, and he was running off a hill and he'd glide. Okay, that's not flight. It's not powered flight, but it is a form of flying. Certainly you're covering distance as well as going down, so it's a form of flying. So when the Wright brothers first went out there, I'm sorry, did I say 1,000,000 pounds? Maybe it's more like 480,000 pounds if I project happens to be an F-16 pilot, who's going to lecture me on aviation. But when the Wright brothers went to first build their first flyer, their first gliders, and they didn't start with a powered airplane. They went with basics, started with kites. And they started to build a little unmanned glider and then manned gliders. And they went out to Kitty Hawk. And they went to Kitty Hawk from Ohio. They lived in Ohio. They went all the way down to North Carolina because Kitty Hawk had the highest regularly sustained winds that they could find. Winds hitting the dunes would go up, and that's generating not lift in the true sense, but it's generating a form of lift where the air is moving upwards. Mountain, it's a ridge lift. Thermal lift is another kind of lift where the air goes up. But what that did was helping them, was buying them more time, basically, because a glider in rising air will stay in the air longer than a glider in steady air will, because the air is taking the glider up as the glider comes down. By the way, for those of you who are interested, because once we get on flying, you can't stop me. I was a glider pilot for a long time, and here's a question for you: How does a glider that releases from the tow plane at 2,000 feet climb to 10,000 feet? How does that happen? Does the glider go up through the air? No, gliders can't go up. They don't have any power source. What happens when you're in a thermal or use thermal lift, a rising pocket of air, to go from 2,000 feet to 10,000 feet? The way that works is your glider is always descending. It's always descending. It has to descend through the air to maintain its forward velocity. It's efficient, but it's not magical. Glider can't just go up through the air. Glider's always coming down through the air mass, always. But if you have a powerful enough thermal, what's happening is that pocket of air is rising faster than the glider is descending through it. So if you imagine a ball rolling down the stairs, that's what the glider's doing. But if you imagine an escalator, and the escalator's running really fast, then the escalator is actually taking that falling ball upwards. Because as the ball goes down, drops, the ball's always coming down relative to the stairs, but if the stairs themselves are moving up fast enough, the ball, which is constantly descending, will in fact go up. And that's basically how gliders gain lift. But that's the kind of lift that's determined by the atmosphere, not the kind of lift that comes off the top of a wing. Anyway, my whole point with Bernoulli was the Wright brothers went out there, and tables of pressure differentials had been devised. And as Amendment 10 points out, it's off of Kill Devil Hill. So air pressure tables had been devised, and the Wright brothers built their first flyers, their first gliders, based on existing air pressure gradients and tables. And they got out to Kill Devil Hills out in Kitty Hawk, and they got on their gliders, and the things just fell out of the sky. They just came down. They didn't work at all. And what the Wright brothers did was they had the practical mindedness. They had the practical mindedness to understand that one of two things was happening. Either they had built the wing so completely incompetently that it wasn't working, they knew that wasn't the case, or the pressure tables were wrong. And that's exactly what happened. They realized that the pressure tables were optimistic. I don't remember if it was a factor of 50% or 300%. It was something big, some major overestimation of how much lift they were going to get. So they basically, here's why the Wright brothers succeeded instead of anybody else. If you had been the Wright brothers, if I'd been one of the Wright brothers, and I find out, man, these pressure tables have to be smaller, they're not working. They're underreporting how much lift we're getting. We should be getting more lift than we're getting according to these tables. I would simply, okay, I'll just make a bigger wing. But that's not what the Wright brothers did. The Wright brothers said, if we're going to understand this and engineer it throughout the course of our career, we can't just slap a bigger wing on there. We have to understand what the actual values are before we do any more building. So the Wright brothers not only built the first flying airplane, the Wright brothers also built the first wind tunnel. The Wright brothers said, all right, look, we're not just going to go dick around out there. This is what it really comes down to, right? This is what everybody else was doing. They're dicking around. Yeah, well, it's got a boat with it. Well, it's got a wing. It looks like a seagull. All right, well, it's not working. Well, let's dick around and put a tail on it and make it look like feathers. Is that working? Nah. Yeah, well, why don't we, we'll dick around and we'll make the wings flap. These guys didn't dick around. They basically just said, all right, our air pressure tables are the whole thing. Everything depends on the science of the Bernoulli principle of lift being caused by accelerating air on the top of the wing. So the Wright brothers said, instead of us just going out there and dicking around, let's get the real numbers. And once we have the real numbers, we can design for the rest of our lives. And that's exactly what they did. They built by hand in their bicycle shop a wooden tunnel, and they built a mechanical fan to drive this thing, and then they built little cross sections of their wings, and they suspended them by wires. And these were little tiny little things. The model wings were about this big. And they suspended them by a wire, and they had a certain wing shape and a certain angle of attack, which is the angle at which the wing curvature is more or less set. Flaps change the curvature of the wing, and so do slats. But for the time being, assume we got a fabric wing, and it's more or less set in its curvature. So they would mount that, and then they change the angle at which the wing intercepted the incoming air, called the relative wind. And they began to just with a little measure, they just had a little tiny little scale, and they're measuring how much lighter the wing got when air was flowing over it at a certain rate. And they changed the angle of attack, and they changed the curvature, called the camber of the wings. They changed the air speed. All three of these things, angle of attack, airspeed, and camber, affect the lift. And they started to find out what the best combinations were. So when they went out there next time, they weren't just dicking around. They had the answers. They knew what they were doing. They looked at it like scientists. And unlike pure scientists, they were also mechanics. They were not engineers. They were mechanics. They built bicycles. So if you need a wind tunnel, you don't get to go to eBay or Amazon and order a wind tunnel. No one knows what a wind tunnel is. You have to build one. You have to construct one. You have to not only the mechanicals of building a wind tunnel are not terribly hard, but you have to understand what you're trying to do. No one had ever thought of these things before. It's amazing. Absolutely amazing. And I'm ashamed I don't know his name. I bet you somebody in the comment section does before I finish telling this story. The great unsung hero of flight is not just the Wright brothers who built the flyer and used a form of control called wing warping, which is not practical. It's not really practical for canvas and fabric wings. It's utterly impractical for hardwood or aluminum wings, or carbon fiber wings for that matter. But the Wright brothers built the controllable vehicle, and they did the wings, and they did all this other stuff. Charlie Taylor, that's the name. I couldn't remember it. Thank you, Amendment 10. The great unsung hero of flight is a guy you've never heard of. His name is Charlie Taylor. Charlie Taylor was just a mechanic and a tinkerer, and he built the engine on the Wright Flyer because the Wright brothers were looking for an engine, and they had a pretty good idea of how much horsepower they needed, but it also had an idea of how much weight it could be, because that's the whole battle, right? How much lift can we get? And if we can cut the weight, every pound of weight that we don't have to carry is a pound of lift that we don't need to get. So they could not find an engine that was powerful enough and light enough to do the job. And along comes Charlie Taylor, who, to my understanding, I'm ready to stand corrected here for people who know more about this than I do, is basically just a mechanic. And he built this four-cylinder engine out of aluminum. And thanks, Amendment 10, for pointing that out. And it generated about 13 horsepower. And that was just enough, because if you notice the first flight pictures, that thing didn't go climbing out at a 70-degree deck angle and accelerate on the way up. They just barely had enough to get the thing off the ground. And as ATS 608 points out, they weren't government subsidized. And you may say, oh, that's trivial. Now you're just sniping. No, not sniping. Because there was somebody who was, in fact, subsidized, and that was Langley. Langley was the big brain, right? Langley was a professor of aeronautics, I think he was, and he was backed by the Smithsonian Institution. He was given a large budget to build a practical flying machine, and he launched him into the Potomac or the Hudson, I can't remember which, launched him into a river, because he knew they weren't going to do he's backing himself up, right? They were called aerodromes, I think, and they looked nothing like a modern airplane. They looked like they looked almost a little bit like a really ugly sort of dragonfly. 2 wings in the front, 2 wings in the back, about the same size, and hideously heavy. And I think they might have tried to pilot in it once, and it was literally like one of those comedy routines. They launched him off a rail over the river, and it was like a Red Bull event, where you're trying to fly the Statue of Liberty, just splash. Not just a failure, not even close. Not even close. Didn't look anything like an airplane. If you look at the Wright brothers airplane, you've got wings, you've got a tail. You had pusher props, and they switched to tractor props, but now we have pusher props in the form of turbofan engines, which is essentially a multi-bladed propeller that's driven by a jet engine. You have a gas turbine engine and a turboprop. Every commercial jet you've ever flown has basically, the fan is a propeller, and it's a pusher propeller. Anyway, here's old Charlie Taylor just tinkering around, just good old American mechanic, and he just built this thing for them. And as Amendment 10 says, bless his heart, I don't know what we'd do. The first flight was 120 feet. The first flight was well inside the wingspan of a 747, well inside. The second flight was a little bit longer. The third flight was a little bit longer. But the fourth flight was significantly longer, much, much longer, 5 or 6 times the distance of the first 3. And then it was time to fly again, but they didn't secure the airplane, and they were celebrating their win. You know, hey, we just got a decent one off, and the wind came up and smashed it. Parts of it made it to the Smithsonian in the form of the Wright Flyer, but the airplane that flew, the structure that flew the first 4 flights was destroyed after the 4th flight because they just weren't paying attention. It's got to be a heartbreaker, right? You spent all this years and years and years. And if you ever see the Wright brothers' shack at Kitty Hawk, you realize these guys were living in sand fleas and just cans of beans, just ladders and cots and bunks. These 2 brothers out there in the middle of the night, in the middle of nowhere by themselves. That's dedication, man. You go out there they went 3, 4, 5 years before they got the flight. So finally they get the problem solved. They get their engine working, and they get their pressure tables working, and they've survived their glider test. They're still alive after that. And you finally built the world's first flying machine. First attempt, but you flew. Second attempt, a little better. Third attempt, a little better. Fourth attempt is like, hey, man, we got the hang of this. We got that. And then, woo, let's go celebrate. And the wind comes and smashes it. It's hard to take, but kind of cool in the same way, you know. But I have so much admiration for the Wright brothers. I have so much admiration for them because of their methodical. That's what it was. The methodical quality of it. They did not just go out there and dick around. They had to go out there, learn. They had to go out there to learn what they didn't know. And then when they had a fair idea of what it was that they didn't know, they invented ways to find out what it was that they didn't know. And then they took what they learned and built that into things, and then those things went out to find out what else they didn't know. And if you've ever flown the Wright Flyer in a flight sim, it's unflyable. The Wright brothers did something else that was really odd. If you look at every airplane in the sky today, with the exception of fighter aircraft, but every commercial airplane, every private airplane, and in fact, virtually every airplane, commercial jetliners, obviously. If you look at them from the front, the wings, as the wings move out, they go up. That's called dihedral. And dihedral is a stabilizing tendency. If you think about dihedral, the best way to think about dihedral is if you imagine a wooden salad bowl and a tennis ball. If you have the salad ball pointed down so that the dome is on top, and you put a tennis ball on the top, the slightest little movement of the tennis ball will accelerate as it rolls off of the side of the tennis ball. It gets faster and faster and faster as it rolls down the side. That's a dynamically unstable position. If, on the other hand, the bowl is inverted and it goes up to the sides, then the ball will just come right back to the center. And that's exactly why airplane wings are tilted up. It levels the airplane in roll. It's a natural leveling device. It's called dihedral. But the Wright brothers were worried about that because they thought if the wind got underneath a raised wingtip, it might flip the plane over. So what they actually did was they built anhedral. They built the wings to slowly slope down, which prevented this problem that probably wasn't much of a problem, but made the plane unbearably complicated and tough to control. It's a miracle they could fly that thing at all. But that's it. And if you ever get a chance to see an antique air show and see one of there's Wright Flyer replicas out there, but the airplane that they actually really flew was it the Model B? The 1905 aircraft, I think it was. They took a year off after they flew to start getting their legal stuff in order. But, you know, I told this story before, I told it last time on the Stratosphere Lounge. Last thing I'll say about it, we'll call it a night. So the Wright brothers invent flight, and they have a picture taken, and the world has announced that the Americans have done it, and the French deny it, and Germans deny it, and a lot of people deny it and say, I don't know, it's another gliding attempt, and it was launched by a catapult which gave it energy, and all that other stuff. So there's a lot of questions and concerns about it. So the Wright brothers, as soon as they do it, again, this methodical Yankee kind of mind, they stop flying for a year or two, or maybe even longer. Maybe it was even 3. And what happens is the Wright brothers give up flying. They just don't fly anymore because they start to pursue patent. They start to pursue the wing warping, and they start to pursue the engine. They try to patent the entire idea, and they're trying to legally protect themselves so they can make money off of this thing. So for 2 or 3 years after the first flight of the first airplane, the Wright brothers just not there. It may have been longer, may have been 4 or 5 years. I don't remember the exact date. But what I do remember very well without the date is within 4 or 5 years of the first flight, there was the French were having an aerodrome kind of a celebration of flight kind of thing, and the French had made some real progress. A bunch of people were actually flying heavier than air machines. And so the Wright brothers finally, after many, many years of being out of the scene, go to this event, and they bring their Model B or whatever it was, their second design, which is kind of a sit upright instead of lie on it kind of design. And the French are mocking and scoffing at them, and saying you didn't really do anything, and look at us now, and they're up there. Now the French and the other Europeans, in order to turn the airplane, they'd seen the airplane. This is really a key thing. The French and the Europeans had seen the airplane as a boat that goes through the air. And so in order to turn the boat, you would use the rudder, which basically yaws the plane side to side. And so the French were trying to turn the plane using the rudder. And it is possible to turn a plane using a rudder, but it takes you forever. The plane just wants to fly straight, so you constantly have to slowly put this thing in there, and there's adverse yaw and all kinds of other things. But the point is, the Europeans were trying to turn like a boat. The Wright brothers didn't see the airplane as a boat. They thought of it as a bicycle. And so the way you turn a bicycle is you lean. You lean into the turn. And then you let the natural lift inclination, the lift vector, you let that turn the airplane. So the Wright brothers got to this event in France and faced a lot of scorn. And the second that they took off and started their first turn, the French, everybody, all of the Europeans, literally just dropped their sandwiches and their ice cream cones. Where it's just like, okay, we surrender. They're the geniuses, because the Wright Flyer was making turns in an eighth of what the competing Europeans were doing, because they were trying to steer the thing with a rudder, trying to yaw it around. The Wright brothers rolled into a turn, used the lift vector, and just poof, and off they went, because they were bicycle mechanics. They were bicyclists and bicycle mechanics. It's the greatest story ever. It's the most American story ever. And when Barack Obama, several State of the Unions ago, 3 or 4 years ago, talked about the Wright brothers in the context of the government, and in terms of like, if it weren't for the government, we wouldn't have had the first flight. Like everything else this guy says, it's like gaslighting. It's like, he couldn't have said that. I mean, that's an inversion of the truth, right? I mean, nobody else heard that? No, what are you talking about? The Wright brothers were the inversion of the government. The government had a program with Langley, and his aerodromes, or whatever they were called, or velociraptors, or whatever the damn things were named, just kept going kersplash. And he had a budget. He had hundreds of thousands of dollars. And he was the big brain, and he was the celebrated director of the Smithsonian Institute, or whatever the hell else he was. And he was the great man, and he was the famous one, and all the newspapers asked him, how's it going, Dr. Langley? Well, my velocipede, or my aerodrome, or whatever, and blah, 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 blah. And he creates this thing that doesn't even look like an airplane, and kersplash, kerplash, kerplash, kerplash. Meanwhile, a couple of guys who live in Ohio, whose father is a reverend, a couple of weirdo bachelors, whose only female contact was their sister, get in a bloody train and covered with canvas and birch. They go to flea-infested, North Carolina beaches and live on the beaches in these primitive conditions, eating cans of beans at night, sitting up talking, arguing with each other. It's said about the Wright brothers that they had a kind of relationship where Orville would take a position, Wilbur would take a position, they'd start screaming and yelling at each other, and 4 hours later, Orville would have Wilbur's position and Wilbur would have Orville's position. And they were just together, just knocking it out, figuring out how to do it. And they didn't have any money except their own money, and they didn't have any support except their own support. They didn't have anything except for their own belief in themselves and their independence. And what they needed, they built. And what broke, they had to fix. They're bloody marvels, those two guys. Absolute marvels. And, we couldn't do it today in a million years. Because of the government. How many Wright brothers out there right now, I wonder? How many geniuses, how many people with this idea that they got a new way of doing things and simply won't ever have a chance? How many Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniaks are there out there who had an idea that could have changed the world the way that an iPhone changed? How many people are there that are just not going to get a chance because of this stuff? A lot of people. You just leave them alone. Just leave them alone and watch what happens. But no, can't do that. I actually did some shooting, shot some video with the and they talk to your iPad or your iPhone with a Wi-Fi signal, so you can see what the camera's seeing. And I had intermittent results with it. The video was good. It kept dropping the signal. But I'm going to do a little flying video from inside the Sky Arrow, and we'll get up there and I'll show you what it's all about for the low and slow of us. I have so many jokes about my airplane, and I have the slowest airplane in the sky, and it's I think a line of like 9 jokes slower than Christmas. It's the only airplane that's been certified to survive a bird strike from the rear. It doesn't have an airspeed indicator. It has a calendar. It's passed by hot air balloons routinely. It's just a really slow airplane. And when I say slow, it's an 80-knot airplane, 85, 90 knots. It's 100 miles an hour. It's blown backwards in some cases. But I do love it so much, and it's so friendly, and it feels like a fighter airplane. It's got a canopy, and it's got a stick on the right and a throttle on the left, the way God intended. And, there you go. So anyway, we'll do a flying thing. Let's see if we can talk about, maybe we'll do a flying episode next time, or a movie episode. I'm in the mood for a theme episode. Although this was a one-word episode, and that was fun too.